Hello and welcome to Google Firestarters. I'm Neil Perkin, a very croaky Neil Perkin because I'm losing my voice, but hopefully it will stick around for long enough for us to do this. But welcome to Google Firestarters. I am the moderator and facilitator of Google Firestarters and also the founder of consultancy business Only Dead Fish. And for the uninitiated, Firestarters was a series of events that we did at Google. Focusing on the areas of challenge and opportunity in the advertising and marketing and media industry. And we ran those for about 10 years. And obviously we pivoted these in the era of COVID into live video chats, which we're doing. And we're doing them with the interested and interesting of the industries, we like to say. And today's guest is no exception to that. So today's guest is Tom Morton, who's the Chief Strategy Officer with RGA. So Tom, would you care to introduce yourself?
Yes, Neil. Hello. Thank you for having me. I am Tom Morton. I am the Chief Strategy Officer at RGA. I'm based out of our New York headquarters. I've been in New York for about 10 years now, doing a mix of agency work, agency startups, brand consultancy, and for the last 5 years, RGA. I grew up in the UK scene. I was a trainee at DDB back in the day, then several years at Rainey Kelly and TBWA.
Brilliant. Great to have you, Tom. So as you may know, Firestarters is obviously structured around the sort of 5 core kind of questions. So I'm just going to leap straight into the first one, which is all about learning and the best thing that you've actually learned in your career across all those different organizations and agencies. So what would you say the best thing that you've learned is?
I want to talk about 2 things that I've learned, because I think I have, every job I've had, I've learned something, and I've tried to parlay that into my practice and take that forward. And I think my big lesson from learning the craft in the UK is how much strategy is just about assembling truths and really like thinking about what are the truths about your organization or about the world or about your users that create advantage for you. You know, what do you do? What do you have within your arsenal that matches a need that's out there somewhere in the world? I know Lawrence Friedman, when he wrote about his definition of strategy, he describes strategy as being about the art of creating advantages, and I think that's a really profound way of thinking about the craft. I think where I first realised I'd learned something as a strategist was actually about 5 years into my career. I was working on the launch of Virgin Mobile, which had launched as a with, if you like, moderate success as a discount company. And I looked at all the truths about the product and about Virgin, about the situation. And really what Virgin Mobile was it was a company that had it had a cool brand. It was sold in record shops, which you have to believe me were a thing. And it was the only company that had like a pay-as-you-go service that actually looked after its customers and rewarded them. So it was like the only way you could have a nice phone without an expensive contract. And basically summing those truths together, I said, why don't we actually go to market as a high-end youth brand? Because no one's ever, at the time, the mobile category had never had that. And just discovering that it wasn't like an assertion or something I plucked from the sky, but basically I just managed to create this kind of Jenga stack of truths, and that had allowed us to get to somewhere completely new. I think that was like a really profound lesson for me. Is just that assembly of truths. And then there's my second big, if that was like the big lessons in the first half of my career, the big lesson in the second half was really about how you harness the collective power of different forms of strategy working together. My first job in the US was was actually at Havas, which despite being a French company, was headquartered in New York. And I came in as a CSO, and it was a very there were a lot of different fragmented disciplines, but luckily happened to be under one roof. And suddenly realizing that there was this incredible power that if you had UX people and media people and analytics people, as well as brand people, if they worked together, they would come up with something different. That actually the intersection of their perspectives would create something amazing. And I think that was probably one of the most productive years of my career, was working out what you could achieve and what you could win when you've got that kind of collectivity together. I think there's probably a category error in our industry that assumes that creativity and evidence are opposing forces. or that, let's say, only quote brand strategists get to have breakthroughs. And it's just not true, because actually it's the intersection of truths and perspectives that get you to these much bolder outcomes.
That's really interesting. I'm going to come back to that first point, actually, if I may, because I read a piece that you interviewed by Contagious magazine about your strategy diet. And in that piece, you were talking a bit about how agencies often spend a lot of time guessing the problem that the client actually has. And actually, the CEO and investors are readily signaling what it is because of things like the intelligence from the top, as I think you called it. So earnings statements and analyst reports and IPO filings and things like that. Do you think that the kind of inputs which strategists and planners often use are just a bit too one-dimensional? They're not thinking big enough about that?
It's one way to pull back and find something ambitious to work on. Because I think a lot of our craft, a lot of our success depends on having like more interesting problems to solve, or higher order problems to solve, or just something of like a greater magnitude. And I think so often you see that we're like in the top of organizations where like the CEO has told Wall Street that their ambition is to grow from this many customers to that many customers. And what you can do, you can take them at their word. And it's kind of extraordinary with the power of going back to like your day-to-day clients and reminding them of the company's overall ambition and actually almost working back from it. And again, you would think that reading the interview with the CEO or going through the last earnings statement might lead you to a very dull place. Actually, it's just a breadcrumb trail towards where is this company's ambition and where is it trying to grow to. And you can look at that very quickly, work out what you might want to achieve.
If I can just come back to that second point again, because that is a particularly interesting kind of topic right now, I think, about how you bring together different disciplines to kind of work more concurrently. And that kind of intersection of perspectives, as you called it. So what's the kind of journey that RGA have gone on here? I mean, do you actually genuinely work as kind of multidisciplinary sort of teams in one place at the same time solving problems like that? Is that how it works?
Well, I'm not sure if anyone works in one place now, but
yeah,
the multidisciplinary thing is really real. I think it's the advantage of being in a company that grew up as a digital agency and before that as a design company, is that it's naturally stocked with lots of different types of people. And if I look at, let's say, the totality of like strategy flavored people, there's probably in our New York office, there's probably an equal number of people who have from consultancy place, from a media and connections place, from a data place, or from like a general brand strategy place. And what that also means, because there's roughly even numbers, it also means there's parity of esteem. So I think there's a lot of companies, a lot of companies in our industry, they show their secret hierarchy by what's the biggest discipline, or who gets to have the final word. And what's interesting about the culture of RGA, because it's such a brutally collaborative place, is there is no one discipline that gets the final say. And so that creates this extraordinary equal playing field, where we're basically like success doesn't come from like who's got the loudest voice, or who's always allowed to sit at the tip of the organization. It actually it comes from those different points of view together.
And what does that mean for process? Because the traditional kind of agency processes are quite sort of linear, aren't they? They're sort of a handoff from one team to another team to another team, creative to media and so on. So is that kind of a disruption of the traditional process? Is that finished, dead?
I'm not sure how granular I can go, because all projects are different. But one of the important things, if you want that kind of intersection, is you're going to need to have the different disciplines in on the problem early. If you speak to any specialist, and the great thing about RGA is basically it's a soup of specialists. The one thing that everyone says is bring us in early, and I think that does work, because when you come in early, you come in at higher altitude. So if you're an analytics and marketing science person, if you come in early, you're coming in to use your skills to diagnose the problem. If you come in late, all you can do is like wrist up a quick measurement framework. But come in early, and your findings and your discovery are going to shape what we do.
Is that more about helping the client to understand the problem that they actually need to solve, rather than coming up with a solution for an already diagnosed problem?
It's going to vary. I think one of the joys we have at RJ is that sometimes clients come in with extremely open-ended problems, and that also allows us to take a slightly more consultative approach. We often talk in the company about altitudes. Sometimes a problem comes in at a very high altitude where the answer could be anything. Sometimes it comes in very specifically. There's a product we want to build, a market we want to attack, a big cultural moment we want to create, and that's okay. You just recalibrate. I think part of the art of strategy is recognizing when your job is to come up with the best version of what you've been asked to do, versus when you come in at a different altitude where the answer could be anything.
And what does that mean for the job of a strategist or a planner? How does that change in that context, do you think?
I think it means you have to be able to toggle up or down very easily.
Yeah.
Let's take something like, I'm going to use a broad brush term here. Let's take something like experience work. Sometimes it's very open-ended. The highest altitude is literally what should be our product roadmap, what should be our ecosystem. Then there's a click down to the design and build. What should we make? How can we make it great? And then there's the activation. The how do we create a big moment for our users? And I think just that ability to toggle up or down becomes a real skill.
Yeah.
It doesn't mean that one of those jobs is better or purer than another.
So we talked there about things that you've learned. What about mistakes that you've made, or learnings from mistakes? Let's put it like that. What do you think has been your biggest?
This actually caused me to do a bit of reflection here, and honestly, I thought back to my early days as a CSO in London, and the great thing about when you're in let's say a back in the day C-suite person, a British agency, is it's kind of terrific, because if you want it, there's a lunch budget. You get to come into meetings and do your swinging hot takes, or you get to try and like rule by proclamation, and you probably get a nice office as well, and that can be very seductive. But the problem is none of it actually makes a difference to the work. And I think realizing that the trappings and the status don't matter was probably my biggest revelation, my biggest pivot. Because I had that experience. Then I moved to America. I moved without a job, and I had to go and find something new to do. And the company that I went to work for, I came in and I said one of the first conversations about where would I sit, what would my office be, and there was a beautiful 9th floor place where the C-suite sat, and there were balconies and so on. I said, would it be okay if I just sat in the place where I could influence the work? And they took me at my word, and they put me in this tiny box of an office next to the vending machine and the photocopier, with an uninterrupted view of a derelict Verizon parking garage. But the great thing about it was the absolute intersection between where the media people sat, the UX people sat, the strategists sat, and the creative sat, which meant I got to see the intersection, and I got to make a difference because I was there in the machinery. And for me that was a lesson. None of your influence comes from your status. All your influence comes from what you do with the talent and the work, even if, and probably because, you're sitting next to the vending machine and the copier.
So what does that actually mean, though? For like a day-to-day, you kind of sat in the middle there, but what does that mean in terms of the work and how the work got done? The fact that you're so close to all of those different parts of it.
It meant you can go from place to place and be a connector. You can see things. If you have to, I guess this is one of the great levelers we've had from remote work, is it doesn't matter whether you sit next to someone or you're 4 floors above. I think your ability to check in and be intimate and share the thought, that's really where the power comes from. It's where the influence comes from.
Yeah, I mean, I guess there's a broader thought here, isn't it, about you mentioned like the C-suite sort of being on a certain floor and not really kind of
Mm.
niggling and walking the floor, I think we used to call it back in my day.
Yeah.
So the idea of like, actually going and seeing the work being done. So what do you think is like, turn this into context of a kind of leadership thing, I suppose, but what's the benefit that leaders get from actually seeing the work getting done, being in the middle of it, being able to kind of talk to the people actually doing the work?
That's where it's real. I think the advantage of the creative industry is our job is inherently interesting.
Mm.
Management in the creative industry isn't necessarily about motivation, because we get to make cool things, we get to solve interesting problems, we get to use our brains. The task is really about clearing a path for people to do their best work. And I think you have to see you have to see what people are going through, where the road bumps are, and really like to understand the complexities and nuances of the problems people are trying to solve and the working dynamics they're in. Because otherwise, as a leader, you're coming up with like hypothetical solutions rather than just being there in the room. There's a phrase that Sean Lyons, who's the CEO at RJ, often uses, which is he says the work drives the model. And so, like, the company philosophy is often derived from the work we've done, the encounters with clients we've had, because we know that's real. That's probably like the highest source of truth.
Yeah,
and that's very different from trying to like rule by kind of govern by proclamation.
really interesting thinking about the RGA context here, because you've got a very diverse set of outputs that you actually do. And so I guess I'm kind of interested in your insight here from working across both campaigns and experience and technology, all of these different areas, about your insights for where the actual industry is going in marketing, advertising. So where do you think the industry itself is heading right now?
I'm really struck by just how radical the changes of the last year have been.
Yeah.
I think there were a lot of think pieces written last year about how we can't wait to go back to normal and planning for the new normal and so on. I think we're missing out just what a radical year 2020 was, and just how different the world is going to be. Now, 2020 was a lot of things. It was also the year when the world genuinely went digital first. McKinsey did this extraordinary study, and they basically showed that the adoption of digital technology, whether that was in terms of products and services or customer interactions, had basically like leapt forward between 3 and 5 years in the first half of last year alone.
Yeah.
So we're now in this world where I think their statistics were it's like 58% of interactions with companies, customer interactions with companies, are digital. 55% of the world's products and services have been part digitized. And then eMarketer, which keeps a track on these things, spotted that 2019 had been the first year where the majority of the world's media spend was digital. This year, it grew more, it's 55%. And so we're now at this point where it's officially this digital first world. And so all the talk about disruption and there's new companies are going to overthrow incumbents and you need to change to stay ahead. The point is that's happened. That debate is over. That's been won.
Yeah.
So you have to accept that. And at the same time, if that's like one of the vectors of change, the other one is actually just how dramatically people around the world are just demanding greater humanity and greater accountability from the businesses and the brands that are serving them.
Okay.
Again, Edelman did their annual trust study, and it turns out that around the world, 80% of the world's consumers expected the brands that served them to also be dealing with social problems. And it's like it gets more the younger you go. Like there's like more than 80% of the world's Gen Zs think that companies ought to be solving women's equality, job creation, racial equity, data privacy, and so you have these two absolute tidal wave forces that technology is one, this incredible demand for humanity, and we're now in a situation in terms of where the industry is going, where the smart companies are the ones who are connecting those two things, and they're working out how do you use technology to better serve humanity? How do you use this incredible technology to be better citizens of the world? We do a lot of work with Uber, And their brand book has this extraordinary phrase. It said that we used to show up as a disruptor, and now we show up as a builder. And I think you can see that in so many companies trying, who are trying to figure out how you use the incredible resources, the technological resources you have, to be good and to be human. Like when Satya Nadella talks about what happens at Microsoft, he always talks about empathy, and not as a soft skill, but basically as we can't serve our customers, we can't grow unless you have a very deep feeling for people's needs. And so you're now at this extraordinary stage where Interbrand that published their annual list of like the 100 most valuable global brands and the 100 fastest growing global brands, and the top 5 in all of them is basically it's all technology companies, and it's all technology companies with like a deep-seated sense of serving humans, whether that's like Apple, Adobe, Spotify, Samsung, Microsoft. It's kind of extraordinary. And I think that's really like where the industry is going now. If you could define it in one way, it's basically how do you use technology to serve people as humans better?
Where you started that answer was talking a bit about what's happened, obviously, in the pandemic, and all the kind of amplification and acceleration of a lot of the kind of longer term trends, I suppose, that we've seen. But how much of it do you think is just an amplification or an acceleration of things that were already there, and how much of it is completely new that actually we've never seen this before?
I think even the amplification is important, because I don't think any of these things are blips. So like Nike's a founding client of ours, and their direct consumer business grew by 80% last year, and they don't see that as like a tactical blip. They see that as basically the path of growth. They say that they're now 3 years ahead of their goal on the back of that. Like Uber's food delivery business grew by it more than doubled last year, for very obvious reasons. But they don't think that's going to disappear. That now becomes like an absolute pillar of the business. And I think that's also true of these demands for humanity, because the numbers are so high. It suggests this can't just be a millennial thing, a London thing, a coastal thing, because it's the majority of people.
Yeah.
And I think we see this especially just from the vantage point of being in the US, where if you look at almost like every generation in the US, each one becomes like dramatically more diverse. We're now at a point where if you look at like the graduating classes from college right now, are about 45% people of color. It's about 1 in 8 Gen Zs that have some form have like a different gender identity. These things are so big, and I think like treating them as blips or distractions from doing the business is just false. Like the revolution doesn't care about your content calendar.
I mean, it feels as though what you're talking about there is really long-lasting change, or at least I'd like to think it was. So do you think that out of the pandemic, more of this kind of thing is actually going to stick, and it's going to create that kind of we've changed for good and we're never going back type of?
I think it's going to accelerate. We did a lot of work with American Express, and we were looking at what's been happening to small businesses. And the truth is, most of the small businesses that have come out of the recession, so they come out of lockdown, but had to do some kind of pivot. They had to do like a reinvention.
Yeah.
Where that was like working out how to serve remotely or changing up the product mix. And when you talk to these companies, it turns out like about 3/4 of them say this is the new normal. This is our permanent business. And I think it's getting locked in. Once you can like select a pair of sneakers, once you can design a pair of sneakers on your phone and have them custom made and sent to you, the idea of like going to a store, going up a couple, finding your way into a store and waiting for a member of staff to tell you that they don't have your size. I don't know if anyone's going to be romantic about going back to that world. Just because there's a lot of capital expenditure and a lot of practice that's kind of invested in old ways of doing things doesn't mean that like the public are desperate to go back to them.
And I mean, for a companies, for client companies, obviously this means that they're actually used to kind of perhaps now responding to crises, responding to unpredictable environments in perhaps ways that they weren't before, maybe. So do you think, again, that's something that will actually stick, the ability to be far more responsive and adaptive and so on?
I kind of hope it does. I mean, we work with clients that were, we have one retail client that was almost entirely brick and mortar, and basically stood up a click and collect service from the board meeting that decided to do it to the official launch of it in 5 days.
Wow.
We did a lot of work with Verizon, which is America's biggest mobile phone company, and when the lockdown happened, it was particularly bad because they sell connectivity, and they also have lots of small business customers who are all shuttered, and they basically came to us and said, look, what's the most positive thing we can do? And suddenly, let's say the brand strategy process gets incredibly truncated. It basically gets down to, what are the assets you have? What's the problem that your users have? How are you going to use your strengths to solve those problems? And we stood up a concert series, like a remote concert series, more or less recorded on people's phones, and basically where gigs were played in the basements of the stars in entertainers' houses, and were then broadcast with live streams on any platform that could do live streaming.
Right.
So Twitch, that's been designed for mobile gaming, but that's also it's a live streaming thing. And we stood that up. We stood up in about 2 weeks. And the reason for that is because crisis kind of forces you to act. It truncates the process.
Yeah.
And it simplifies the question. What are the strengths and assets we've got? What are the problems the world has got? How can we get out and solve? It's actually, I think it's made the idea of brand purpose much more important, but it's like taking it down a level. It's not about a hypothetical manifesto belief about what you should do in the world. And it's actually come down to what's the most positive and important thing you do in the world now?
Yeah. So let me flip that, because think about, suddenly companies are standing stuff up in 2 weeks or 5 days, and it's just being able to act like that because it's a crisis. But what's stopping them from doing that in the normal run of things? What gets in the way of that kind of responsiveness?
I think this is going to be the big question for companies: is how do they retain that kind of fast twitch muscle they had when they needed it?
Yeah.
Now, I'm sure there's an element of adrenaline to this. I'm sure there's some of this is like the corporate equivalent of you can lift up a car if there's a loved one stuck underneath it.
Yeah.
But I think that the memory of what's been possible to do, I don't think that's going to go away. And I think because so much of it was about responding to user needs. This wasn't about self-serving corporate targets. It's about how do you help your users in their time of need. And I think any company that has got a user-first perspective on the world will remember that.
I'm going to come back to the other point you were making about doing good in the world and for the good of humanity. The shift towards that, the whole kind of purpose thing. And I'm just curious to understand, from your perspective, what you see the role of agencies working with clients is there. Is it to challenge them, or is it just to facilitate that happening? So how do agencies work with clients in that context?
Around purpose?
Yeah, and doing good in the world.
I think purpose is getting a bad rap right now in the industry. There's this kind of traditional pushback against it. That and I think some of that has been because purpose gets conflated with CSR, and if you see all company activity through the lens of mass advertising, then it may seem that the conversation very quickly goes from what is the company's purpose to what's its CSR initiative to what's it doing on TV when we could be talking about the feature and benefits of our lead product. And so it's got a bad rap from that. The real truth is when you talk to organizations now, when they're talking about purpose, what they really mean is what's our guiding principle? What's the role we have in the world? and like what's the positive role and impact we as a company have in the world. It's kind of down a click, and so not only is that the real working definition of purpose in organizations that care about it. Companies that have purpose are also, they're not using it because it gives them something to talk, it gives them something to televise. They're using the purpose as a guide for action. So they're using it to work out, what should our interface be? What should our new services be? What markets should we go into? How are we an attractive destination for talent? And so I think there's a traditional side to the quotes advertising industry that's looked at purpose with this very narrow lens of, does this belong in a TV spot? When actually it's about companies searching for their difference, their role, their guiding star for their actual actions.
I mean, a previous speaker at Firestarters event, Jan Gooding, she said actually when she was talking about this subject that organizations or companies can have a purpose, but brands can't. It's a company thing to have a purpose, which was quite an interesting angle, I thought, on it. Do you think that's true?
I think it's easier for an organization to have a purpose because it can influence everything. Like an organization has a workforce, an investment strategy. It's got a recruiting structure. It's got a presence in the world that a bottle or a packet just doesn't have. Now, I think there are obviously there are products that can serve certain purposes, or but basically like by association be associated with something good. Maybe it's slightly easier for organizations. I think this might also explain some of the difference between how the purpose debate is playing out in Britain versus playing out in the US. But here, because the truth is, let's say the most valuable companies in the US are, and I'm going to get the order wrong, basically Apple, Microsoft, Google, probably I think it's Apple, Microsoft, Google, Tesla, Amazon. And the thing about all of those is they are companies that are brands.
Yeah.
And so and they have workforces, they have interfaces, they have products that like influence the world. And so thinking about purpose and positive impact is actually, it's a real driver of business. Now you flip over to the UK, where the most valuable companies in the UK are, I think right now it's like Unilever, it's Unilever, Diageo, some mining and resource companies. It's GlaxoSmithKline, AstraZeneca. It's basically it's organizations that basically come to life through products. And so I think working out like how is this packet going to change the world, or working out what's our positive impact on society, is a different degree of magnitude to working out how our technology and our workforce and our ecosystem are going to have a positive influence on the world.
And what do you think this means for brand strategy? Do you think brand strategy, is your prediction it's going to get more important in the future because of that?
Well, here is the crazy pants thing. Gartner every year do a survey that asks CMOs, what's the most important skills for you for your growth? And 2020 was the first year ever where brand strategy was the number one skill that was listed as this is vital to our growth. Now, that I think is a really positive sign. But I guess this comes back to my earlier point. The brand strategy that they're talking about isn't like what's our list of adjectives that we cling to. It's about can we have a clear definition of what's our impact and our role in the world? And they're using that as a guide for action and services and interface and innovation, rather than a guide for what we stick on TV next. And I think because the brand that kind of thinking is being much more foundational to what the company does, a lot of that's going in-house. Not a lot of brand strategy as we know it is now being practiced by people in-house rather than by hired creative agency strategists. So yeah, it's going to be more and more important, but it's just not going to take the form of the agency person drawing up an onion in a workshop and writing 4 adjectives on it.
So a much broader application, I suppose, is what you're saying.
Absolutely, yes. Yeah, And I think because the definition of what the brand is gets broader, the application gets broader, and the application gets much more into what the company does rather than what the company says.
Innovation would be a part of that, I guess.
Oh God, absolutely, yes. And actually using the purpose as a guide for innovation. It's one of the things I think we found very valuable, like doing consulting work at RGA, is realizing that actually brands are really important lens that you can apply to business design, or you can bring to experience design. And yeah, it often gets missed off if you do like a purely mechanistic version of how you design a product.
And how easy is it to do that? I'm kind of interested to explore that, because if you're an experienced designer, you're not necessarily used to thinking about brand. So how can you bring that kind of thinking into that environment?
I think the secret is just to treat it as it's another lens to look at. Yeah, let's say something experience design. Obviously, I'd say probably the dominant school of experience design is human-centered design, and that can be very important for like removing friction and solving problems. It can also be like a wind tunnel, because it can create services that are invisible or interchangeable. And at some point you have to ask, like, why is this? What makes this authentic to a brand? You know, in theory, let's say like an HBO experience should be different from a Disney experience. And you can use brand, and you can use culture. You can also use business as like a really good lens that you can apply, as well as user. It's back to that point about intersections. That just as that you can create more when you've got the intersection between the media thinker, the data thinker, the brand thinker, and the user thinker. You can also design better if you've got like a brand lens, a culture lens, a business lens, and a user lens.
The thought here of what's at the center here. So is that a brand strategy that sits at the center, or is it a purpose that sits at the center? What's the kind of thing that actually informs all of those different parts?
I think the brand becomes really important because it's a principle, and it's a what are we doing here, and it's a why. It's a statement of what guides our actions. So I think brand is here much less as a look and a logo and a line. It's here much more as like an operating system.
That's a really interesting way of thinking about a brand, isn't it? As an operating system.
You could design a brand purely through thinking about its application as an operating system, and you could design it and maybe with no line, with no logo, and it would still be real.
Yeah. And it's interesting from the point of view of just not wanting to stretch it too far, but operating system is an enabler, isn't it? It's a platform on which you lots of other things that actually bring the capabilities to life, because you actually got apps that sit on an operating system or services that sit on an operating system. So do you see a brand like that? Yeah,
completely. Yeah. I think you could probably look at Amazon and Uber as exactly those things. That you have a brand, you have a certain way of behaving, a certain view of an audience, a certain set of capabilities, and you can sit like radically different products on there.
We're running short on time, but I'd love to ask a final kind of catch-all question, if that's all right, which is what's the question that you wish that I'd asked you, and what's your answer to it? So, Tom, if I can ask you that.
It's kind of related to what we're doing right now. So here we are doing having a conversation that's going to appear on YouTube, that's being done for Google Firestarters, and it really speaks like how people learn about and teach about and share strategy right now. And I think a lot of the people who are at the quotes top of the industry grew up in a world of formal training and certification, and there was a conference circuit, there were things you learned, and so on. And a lot of that has just been deconstructed as the agency scene has changed, as new people have come in. And I'm really starting to think now about what's the most positive thing that people in our industry and companies and spokespeople can do to give back, and like how do we start like a real positive teaching discourse? Because I think there's a lot of talk about like the polarization in social media, and let's say the hot takes, the provocative nature of it, and I don't think that's helping anyone. If the classroom or the place for learning now is online and in the feed, how are we making a positive contribution to that? I think there's this incredible moment now for people who are like natural teachers and sharers. I've been following Rishad Tabakawala, the former Publicis Group guru, who's just started a newsletter about like how you run more human organizations. And I think that kind of teaching, that teaching moment now is so incredibly positive. So I think we should probably we should be having a conversation as an industry about how we need more teachers and sharers and fewer provocateurs and gatekeepers in the scene.
Yeah, I really like
anyone right now who's using their Twitter feed to teach or share is doing something, or to amplify other people, is doing something very positive right now.
It's interesting you mentioned there about the kind of binary nature of debate that often happens in those events, and it is in the industry. It is kind of like very binary, isn't it? Sometimes it appears like that. And I was listening to a really interesting podcast the other day by with Ian Leslie and Bruce Daisley. So Ian, he's got a new book coming out in a week called Conflicted, which is all about having healthy conflicts. And his point is he was inspired basically by the fact that actually there aren't much sort of healthy debates really that happen in social media. It tends to generate quite quickly into kind of argument and, I'm in this camp, you're in that camp kind of thing. So do you think there's something really here for planners and strategists around the idea of healthy kind of conflict almost, and to arrive at better solutions or understanding of problems through actual healthy conflict rather than that kind of binary sort of idea?
Absolutely, 100%. I'm going to talk very quickly about something genuinely frightening that happened on the scene in the US quite recently. A former co-worker of mine now works for TikTok, and she wrote some provocative things about the importance of TikTok, and so some of the comments that she got in social media. She had anonymous people telling her to shut up, people threatening her life, and it was horrifying, because here was someone who was relatively young in the industry, offering a point of view, with something to teach about a platform that millions of people are using, and some people were so threatened or angry that they're using their authority or their anonymity to threaten violence. That's a terrible environment for anyone growing up, or for anyone who's trying to find a voice or express a new point of view. And so honestly, I think that spirit of we're from different backgrounds, or we see the world from different vantage points, let's see if we can learn from that, is going to be the only way we can have any kind of discourse online. And I think if the craft is going to move forward, and it's going to be something that interests like new generations of people, rising generations, we're going to have to learn that habit. We can't be snarking. This can't be gatekeeping. Where we can't do this like talk radio.
I mean, it does feel as though on the flip of that is that the sort of planner and strategist community in particular, I think, have been very good and continue to be really good. There's people out there who share lots of content and teach as you describe. But what's the way in which the kind of community can make that flourish, can promote it, can actually encourage that kind of positive debate and conflict?
I think signal boosting anyone who's doing this is important. I don't know, I'd love to see more organizations creating platforms for this. It's why I've always loved Google Firestarters, because it always felt like an authoritative platform for new voices. Maybe we gather again. I don't know.
Yeah. Well, I think it's a good place to wrap up. So thank you, Tom. That was fantastic, really insightful, and really appreciate your time. And my voice did actually hold out, so that's a bonus. But thank you for your time again. And for the viewers of Firestarters, don't forget to look out for the next video. Don't forget to like this one, share it, of course. But my thanks again to Tom Morton. Thank you, Tom.
Thank you for having me.